Hello everyone, my name is McGaddis and welcome to the third installment of a video series of the locked classes for Gloomhaven 2nd Edition. I'll be continuing today with the locked classes with Cthulhu, sometimes known as Squidface, a class we unlocked fairly early on in our campaign, and who one of my fellow mercenaries just finished playing at level 6, having retired this previous week. Probably goes without saying, but the remainder of this video ahead will contain heavy spoilers for the Cthulhu class, so now is the time to turn this video off if you don't want to be spoiled on the information surrounding that class. If you are looking for videos on the spoiler-free starting 6, I have a playlist put together for my video analysis for those classes instead. This video will function as more of a review of this class, as I have not yet myself played the new version of Cthulhu, so my discussion will be more theoretical based on my experiences playing the class in 1st edition and comparing their kit to what is now available in the 2nd edition. My teammate has found the new version of Cthulhu to be a bit of a puzzle to solve at times, as they have changed quite a bit from 1st edition and sport a brand new mechanic, as well as some significant changes to their cards and themes. I will say that flavor-wise, this new version of them is definitely a home run and contains a lot of power for those who are willing to play it well and sequence and enjoy planning ahead and things like that. Okay, spoilers for this video are starting now. The lock name for Cthulhu and Squidface is the Harrower Plague Herald, a long-range debuff negative condition specialist. That was a class I played from level 2 all the way to level 9 in the original game and had a blast doing so. I actually finished one of our Gloomhaven 1st edition campaigns playing this class, as I was having so much fun I didn't want to change over to something else, as I'd already played a large amount of the classes we had available at that point anyways, and not in another player's hands. In 1st edition, Plague Herald was a poison and curse specialist, sporting mechanics that often gave monsters other various negative conditions as well, such as muddle, immobilize, occasionally wound and stun. They had reasonable access to ranged area damage, often hitting multiple targets either through hex area skills or multi-target abilities. They also had an affinity for both wind and dark, which is one aspect that's actually been completely removed from the 2nd edition version of this class. In 2nd edition, this class has gotten quite a facelift, being one of the few classes that actually went down in hand size from 11 to 10. In this case, they had what I would argue is a semi-mandatory persistent loss card in 1st edition that gave them permanent flying. And this has been removed as a card and added to their perk list instead as a single perk mark ability. So essentially their hand size remains the same for the vast majority of players. Instead of spending half of your first round putting up this flying persistent ability, it's now active all the time for a single perk mark, which is well worth it for such a powerful ability that really no one else has access to, at least in the form of a permanent turn 1 ability. As mentioned above, they are also completely elemental agnostic now, not producing or needing any elements for their actions. For Dark, this makes sense as there's already a reasonable amount of classes that interact with Dark, so this wasn't needed for elemental balance at all. For the loss of Wind, this is actually an interesting decision. There's only a very small amount of classes that really interact with Wind in much capacity. I don't personally count the Bruiser as they only have a single card that consumes it. But either way, their new mechanic consists of tokens called Plague tokens, as you can see here, that they're able to give enemies, up to 12 total at a time, and each monster can hold up to 3 of these at a time. They are not negative conditions and they have no inherent effects. The abilities of these Plague tokens will differ from card to card as you use them. However, as a result, you'll often be able to place these and interact with them in the same turn depending on your top and bottom actions. This class has a lot of setup and planning baked into it. So you'll often spend early turns in a new room or a new scenario trying to spread the plague to as many targets as possible, and then trying to utilize abilities that key off of the plague on these targets quickly to kind of turn them into a red mist before your allies get to them. So depending on your party composition and difficulty level, you may need to initiative weave to really have this be at its best. Go slow when inflicting the plague, and then go quickly when trying to cash it in for some sort of effect. Most of your abilities do not remove plague tokens from the monsters, which is good. Typically, the only way these plague tokens are removed is by the monster dying, or you going above your limit of 12, in which case you do have to remove a previously placed plague, as it mentions here. But I think communication is really important with this class. both you communicating who you're hitting and who you might need to stay alive in order for your abilities to actually work properly, but also your allies coordinating with you to have this be achieved in good effect. Maybe your allies go for other monsters. Maybe your allies will weaken the monsters with a plague but don't finish them off, things of that nature. Your abilities with plague tokens will vary pretty wildly in what they actually do, but here are some examples for you to kind of get a scope of. Some of the abilities will deal true damage to plagued monsters. Some will debuff monsters' move or attack values based on how much plague they have. A couple can force plague monsters to attack a nearby other monster and spread the plague that way. And some of your attacks can actually only target plagued targets. Needless to say, pretty much all Plague Heralds will need to interact with Plague tokens to some degree. However, there is another build that is still important to be aware of, even if you don't plan on pursuing it personally. It's a Poisoned Allies build. This, as the name implies, is the other primary facet to the new Plague Herald, and has some shades of Void Warden from Jaws the Lion, if you're familiar with them as well, as they both poison allies, but also gain effects from having poisoned allies. Um, so sometimes it's the same ability, sometimes it's a different ability. Some of your abilities will simply give you an additional effect by poisoning an ally, which you can then turn into a benefit as opposed to a downside through other ability cards. But sometimes these will buff the ally, give them cards back from their discard pile, similar to a stamina potion. Some of them may give them extra actions or extra attacks of that nature. So it's more of a support-focused Plague Herald, but definitely still has a lot of legs and has done some really cool things in our own campaign. So I do think both are perfectly viable. One thing I will say is this build is a little bit less fleshed out than the Plague build at level 1. It has 6 cards with interact with poison or on allies or give allies poison in some way at level 1, as opposed to nearly double that. I believe it's 10 cards that interact with plague at level 1. So you can see the kind of the difference. Another thing I will note is at level 1, you are probably going to have to interact with both themes, at least to some extent. It is difficult to fully specialize early on with this class, but as you gain levels and more options and perks and things like that, you can definitely specialize in one or the other. And I would actually recommend doing that, as part of the power of this class is that the builds are fairly distinct and do not interact super well together at high levels. So you'll probably want to see which cards you have more fun with and pick which side you'd like to play in that case. And even look at your future level ups as well to make that decision. Our play called personally has found it difficult to focus on both at once. Some of the abilities don't line up, and your allies being poisoned is a real cost to keep on them long term due to how much damage monsters can put out to poisoned allies. So one thing that you can, and I will often recommend doing in this video, is using your poison ally abilities in quick succession, then heal off or encourage your allies to heal off the poison, and then rinse and repeat in the next rest cycle. So that's something to keep in mind as well. Um, Both of these builds are fairly complex. This is not a super newbie, I would say, friendly build or class, but I do think you can play it with some practice. And it's really just getting into the theme or the flow of either giving your allies poison or the monster's plague, and then cashing that effect in for some sort of positive benefit on the next turn. Right, I think it's time to start talking about some cards. First up here, we have Accelerated End. This is an attack 3, range 4, and then you add Plague and gain 1 experience if the target already has Plague. This is slightly above average as far as a level 1 range attack, range 4 being the part that is above average as opposed to an attack 3, range 3. This is fairly unexciting in terms of like enabling one of your 2 builds, as it doesn't actually help plague a new target. It simply adds a second plague token to a target that already has one. This is good for some of your abilities that will key off how many plague tokens a target has. Those are typically true damage abilities early on. You get a few other ones at higher levels, but these are definitely less common than ones that just care about how many plague targets you have. So not as powerful as it looks. However, an attack 3 is actually significantly above average for this class, even if this does only hit 1 target, as you typically do attack 1 and attack 2s. So that is notable. If you're just looking at output damage, then the top of this is better than a lot of your other options, even if it doesn't help in your other ways you might expect, like adding plague to a new target or perhaps poison or something like that. Initiative at 76 here is your second slowest at level 1, which is definitely notable as you need a mixture of slow and fast on this class, as mentioned in the introduction. Slow when inflicting the plague, and then fast when using that plague for a payoff is a pretty normal cadence for this class. Bottom designates one enemy that has plague and performs poison all figures adjacent to the designated enemy. So this kind of plays double duty. Do note that this doesn't have a range restriction. Many of your abilities that target plagued enemies don't, which is part of why this class can be such long range. Um, but this, as I was saying, this does play double duty because this can poison both allies and monsters adjacent to the designated enemy. The monster that has plague that you're targeting itself doesn't gain the poison, which is definitely unfortunate, but this can poison other monsters to help your allies deal damage to them, and can poison those allies as well for your poison sub-build there that cares about allies being poisoned. With that being said, this is definitely quite finicky. You do need allies adjacent to the plague target and or monsters, so this won't always have a lot of text, but it's fine when the top half is generally quite usable. Second card here at level 1 is Biting Gnats. This is an attack 1, target 2, range 5 that plagues both targets. And then you muddle all enemies that have plague, of course, including the 2 that you just hit. This has been a very useful and stable action for our Plague Herald. She used it right from level 1 all the way to level 6. I don't think she ever cut it from her deck, as it's very important as an easy, consistent way to flip to attack modifiers, plague 2 targets for your future actions, and muddle anything that happens to have plague. So this was a very common round 1 or turn 1 of a specific room ability to help kind of set up her other actions, and it provides some defensive utility through the muddle. You do have some access to curse, so this muddle is a little bit better than average, and even more so if you have allies that curse as well. So this is what I would argue to be one of your top 3 level 1 cards, very important. If you end up going into the poison sub build later on, you can safely cut this card at higher levels, but at early levels, I'd argue you basically need this kind of action to kind of make things work. Initiative at 21 here is fast for this class, even if it's not fast for many others. So that is also important here. You will really struggle to go faster than 15 on this class. You have one card at level 1 that does so, and one card at level 8. Everything else is slower than 15, and a lot of your cards are going to fall into the 20 to 30 range when they are fast. So this class definitely has some initiative control there. They do tend to go pretty mid-speed, and they lack very late initiatives as well. So overall, pretty poor initiative control, which makes this 21 better than it might seem. Bottom here is a loss. It poisons and muddles all monsters, no range indicator there. As always with negative conditions, when it says all like this, doesn't target your allies because inherently negative conditions only target enemies unless they say otherwise. So this is a fine loss, but not super exciting. It's reasonable in like the last room of a scenario. Get 2 experience, poison and muddle everything, help your allies take them down quickly. But on a 10 card hand, it's hard to justify using this early, especially when you lose access to the double plague top action here that also muddles. Next up, we have Blistering Buboes. Fun little aside here, our Plague Herald named herself Bubo after the bubonic plague, spelled slightly differently, before even seeing this card. So then she was looking at her level 1 cards and had a good laugh. And she said, hey, that's me. So this card's top ability is a loss. Choose up to 4 enemies that have plague. The first enemy suffers 4 damage, the second suffers 3, third suffers 2, and the fourth suffers 1. And it gives you 2 experience, of course, because it's a loss. This is a middle of the road loss. Feels pretty similar to the previous card we just looked at in Biting Gnats bottom, as it's typically going to be reserved for like the back half of a scenario. As you do probably want at least 3 plague targets to really make the most of this. That way you're getting 9 of the potential 10 true damage here. You also want this to line up where it's probably killing 1 or 2 of the targets. So this is fine, and it's nice to have in your back pocket, but overall not like a huge reason to bring the card, although it can be a way to fulfill one of your masteries, which is nice as well. The initiative here at 14 is a massive selling point for the card, as the top does want to go quickly, Potentially you had a bad round of combat previously, your allies are looking kind of low. You can use the top to finish off the monsters and kind of move on to the next room here. And this is your fastest initiative, as mentioned, until very high levels. So this is definitely notable. The bottom also wants to go quickly, so this being a fast initiative is very key here. Bottom is a move 2. Each enemy adds -1 attack to all of their attacks this round for each plague that enemy has. This is actually one of your few payoffs for going tall with plagues early on, i.e. stacking plagues on one or two targets as opposed to as many targets as possible, only having one. Um, so that is something to note here. This can be very effective against monsters that make multiple attacks or area attacks, such as living bones, spitting drakes, things of that nature. But overall, this is just a fine ability. It is just a move too, but of course, it's a defensive, proactive ability, so that does need to go fast. And of course, the fast initiative in itself is very viable for this class because they go so slowly. Um, so I think the biggest selling point here is definitely the initiative, as both halves are fairly medium, but it is quite notable because of how slow this class is. Next up, we have Cormorbid Sting. Top is an attack 2 range 4 poison plague. This is a very solid, reasonable action, playing double duty by enhancing your party's damage against the target through poison, and also advancing your own game plan with plague and doing okay damage. 2 being a pretty normal number for this class, as mentioned, a lot of attack 1s and 2s. Range 4 and 5 is also pretty standard for this class. Definitely appreciated over something like range 3, as you have very low health and defensive capabilities, as you do have the low health start here of 6 at level 1. This is good, but I do prefer actions like Biting Gnats top that can plague multiple targets in a round, as you do not gain access to bottom non-loss actions that inflict plague until level 7. So you want to be plaguing as many targets as possible in early rounds of a room. Initiative at 61 here is definitely unfortunate. Poison likes to go before allies, and attacks like to go quicker in a round whenever possible. And the bottom is another attack that is also range restricted. So both halves want to go typically paired with a faster card. Bottom grants one ally within range 3 poison to grant that ally an attack 2 poison in melee. This is quite nice, although it does have a couple moving parts. You need an ally within range 3, as this is a bottom action, so you're going to have difficult moving with it. That is already next to another monster to hit. This is really nice for the Poison Allies build, as it gives them poison and an immediate payoff for the poison. And you can, the best way to try and sequence this, as mentioned, is to try and do a couple turns of poison payoffs after this, before your ally cleanses it off through one of your heals or their own. If you aren't interested in that kind of build for Plague Herald, then of course this ability is pretty unexciting, as it's mostly a downside to give your ally poison if you aren't leveraging those other cards. Next up, we have Contagious Corpse. This is an attack 3, range 3. If this attack kills the target, gain 1 experience and shuffle 1 curse into the monster attack modifier deck. So attack 3, range 3 here being completely standard. However, this works the opposite of how curses normally work. This does not curse if the target lives, rather if the target dies. So of course, if you are playing with other cards, perks, abilities, and ideally players that are using curses, this can be pretty effective, as curses are significantly better when done in as large of quantities as possible. If this only occasionally kills the monster and is really your only source of curse, then this is definitely a little bit below par. Although it is a fine action, as it is, again, one of your few ways to deal more than 2 damage with an attack. But overall, this is just a fine action, and of course gets better in parties that can curse effectively, or if you take cards that curse effectively, as you have a couple of those, although not as many as before with this class. Initiative at 16 here is really nice. Great fast initiative. Not quite as fast as Bubo's before it, but still very solid and a great reason to pick up this card, as early attacks in a round can be a pretty big game changer. Bottom is a move 3. You may then grant one ally within range 3 that has poison to shields for the round. That ally, of course, needs poison for this to work. This is a good payoff for the poison build, as 2 shields not only negates the downside of poison for the round, but also gives them an extra shield on top of that. Without the poison, this is just a move 3 at a reasonable initiative, which is fine, but a little bit under par. So overall, I find Contagious Corpse to be nice for a curse-centric party, or for people who want to focus on the poison build, but is otherwise fine to leave at home if you're neither of those things. Next card up here is Festering Sores. Top is a Wound Plague at range 4. This then sits in your active zone, and whenever an enemy that has Plague dies, you may discard this card to have 2 enemies within range 3 of the hex where it died gain Plague. So this is a great way to kick off a room or the start of a scenario as well to get Plague going. As long as that target ideally dies within the next round or two, you get 3 Plagues and a couple points of damage from Wound, which is a good deal. It also works mid-room, as the discard effect works when any Plague target dies, so it is more versatile, which is definitely appreciated here as well. Of course, this doesn't contribute a lot to damage, but against shielded targets, a wound is pretty similar in effectiveness to your normal attack 1, attack 2s anyways, and sometimes even better. Initiative at 11 here is your fastest card in your arsenal until level 8, which is a huge selling point for the card as the bottom needs to go fast and the top would ideally like to as well. Bottom is a move 3, and then similarly to Blistering Buboes, each enemy adds -1 move to all their move abilities this round for each plague that enemy has. Reducing monster movement by a point or two is sometimes enough to save the party from an attack, or sometimes even multiple if you really have your plague stacked up. But of course, sometimes this will just be a move 3, which is fine and better than the move 2 Buboes offered with a similar effect. So overall, I think Festering Swords is of a pretty high quality, both reasonable halves and a great fast initiative, kind of tying it together. So I think this will be a level 1 card that most Plague Heralds run. Contagious Corpse, I think, is more on the fence. I think a decent amount of players will run it, but I also think some players will cut it as well, as neither half is really necessary for the class. But if you do like the poison build, then the bottom gets to be pretty powerful here. Next up, we have Path of the Pox. Top, one enemy that has Plague suffers 3 true damage, and then all enemies adjacent to that enemy also suffer 1 true damage, and it always gives 1 experience as long as you have a target. This one was quite good for us as a way to get past high shielded monsters, which are often a problem with your low attack values, and even do some splash damage around them. It's also nice knowing that if something is at 3 or less and is plagued, it's simply dead. No need to worry about pulling a -2 or a null on the attack and making it still be around when you might not have been expecting or planning for it. This one did see a lot of use in our party and a good effect as well. Clean, simple payoff for Plague, and true damage is always better than it looks, and this class does a lot of it, so it's really, really nice. Initiative at 31 here is on the unfortunate side of fine, not quite quick enough to be consistent, but at least it's not 10 to 20 points slower. Bottom here is a loss. It plagues a target within range 4. One enemy within range 3 of the target gains plague. Then one enemy within range 2 of that target gains plague. Then one enemy within range 3 of the third target gains plague. No enemy may gain plague more than once with this ability. So essentially jumps plague between enemies that are shorter and shorter distances from one another. Getting 2 or 3 plagues out of this will be pretty easy. Getting all 4 is going to require a pretty specific setup and arrangement of monsters. This is notable as being a bottom ability that can plague and plague multiple targets, but as a loss in a 10 card hand, it's not something that we used often. However, it can be used with things like Biting Gnats to, in theory, plague up to 6 targets in a round. Your next card in particular wants as many plague targets as possible, so there are some cool combinations you can do with this card. It's just due to the nature of a low hand size and this not actually dealing any damage but purely being a setup card, it is a little unexciting for a loss. The good news is it was essentially free because the top was used so often. As mentioned, the top of this next card, Vile Pestilence, is a payoff for that loss we just talked about. So this attack to all enemies at any range that have Plague, 1 experience, non-loss. This was surprising to me. I actually thought this card was a loss initially when our Plague Herald first used it because it seemed so powerful and such a great payoff for this class. With that being said, of course, this is simply an attack 2, but this was something that she's used all the way from level 1 all the way to level 6 when she retired. Um, Barring a hyper-focused poison build, I think most Plague Heralds are going to pack this at most of their level ups, as this is one of your best non-loss payoffs to consistently hit a bunch of targets. You're plaguing things a lot of the time anyways, and this is such a great follow-up to turns where you have plagued multiple targets. I also love that this has no range restriction on it whatsoever, provided you have line of sight. So this can easily be something like range 5, 6, 7, depending on the scenario. So it's a really solid ability. Initiative at 27 here is similar to what we just spoke about with Path of the Pox as 31. Fine, not particularly fast, although reasonable for this class because of their initiative issues. Bottom is a move 4. This is more important than it looks, as you actually only have 2 of these at level 1, and this is the stronger of the 2 cards in my opinion. Also, move 4 is a lot better than it looks on a class that will typically be flying as early as level 1 or 2 with the perk mark. It's essentially a move 4 jump, but even better than that because you can stand on obstacles and traps and things of that nature. So this will be an important card. Both halves are bread and butter staple actions with a reasonable initiative. So I do think this will make pretty much all Plague Heralds level 1 builds, as you may struggle to deal damage en masse without this kind of ability. Next up is Virulent Strain. Top is a persistent non-loss. On your next 3 attacks performed by one of your allies that has poison, add +1 to the attack as well as plague. This is very solid and ties the 2 builds together at early levels before you can specialize, as your payoffs for having poisoned allies are mostly extra damage and spreading the plague with this card. If you aren't running ways to poison allies for some reason at all, then this has no text. But honestly, I think you're going to have a bit of both builds for the first 2 or 3 levels that you're playing in this class, kind of regardless. Initiative at 72 here is slow, but not extremely. So it's a fairly middle of the road number, but better than 40 to 60 or something in that range. Bottom is each enemy suffers 1 true damage for each plague that enemy has. This will often result or a point or 2 of damage on something like 2 to 3 targets early on. This is pretty reasonable, especially as a bottom action that is range agnostic, as I'm always on the lookout for bottom actions that can deal damage, especially early on and easily. Again, this is an action that starts decent, but scales well with levels and perks as your ability to plague targets improves, and particularly with a few perks as well. So overall, I really do like Virulent Strain. Both halves are solid actions, despite being for different builds. This is the kind of card you're going to want to run early because you're going to be mixing and matching anyways. Next card here is Wretched Yield. Top is an attack 2 range 3. You add +1 to the attack for each plague the target has, and then you heal X self, where X is the number of plagues the target had before the attack. So of course, if your perk from the attack modifier adds a plague, you would not heal based on that amount. So in order for this to be comparable to like a standard range action of attack 3 range 3, they need at least 1 target, actually 1 plague on the target, and then this is an attack 3 range 3 heal oneself, which is a little bit better than average but not super exciting. This does scale well when you go tall on a target for plague, so as many plagues on the target as possible. This caps out at 3 plague targets, of course, because that's simply how the class works. So at best, this is an attack 5 range 3 heal 3 self, which of course is fantastic for a non-loss, but is difficult to do. We found that monsters were often dying before they ever got to 3 plague tokens, with the exceptions of really high health elites and bosses. Initiative at 84 here is your latest for quite some time, so this is definitely notable and is a really nice reason to run this card, even if you're not super excited about the bottom. Sorry, excited about the top, pardon me, because the bottom is your other move 4, as mentioned. If you're running multiple of your move 3s as well as the other move 4, I could see you not running both move 4s. Otherwise, I think you are priced into running at least a couple of your big move actions. And because you have so few of them, it really does kind of limit your scope there. So you are likely running this card unless you're running essentially all of your other move actions, because this class is not very mobile aside from being flying at early levels. Next up, we have Delirium's Dance. Top is an attack 2 range 4. You may give one ally within range 3 of you poison to add stun to the attack and gain 1 experience. This is a fantastic way to lock down a monster, deal some damage to it, and give an ally poison for your abilities that key off of that and need it. I think you'll want to poison an ally with this something like 90 to 95% of the time, as stun and poison will often be an upside in the right situation on this class and is a very potent combination together. Initiative at 68 here sucks for the stun and is not ideal for the bottom either, as it also stuns. Definitely pair this with a faster initiative whenever you plan on using this for either of the two abilities, not just a basic action. Bottom is a loss, as mentioned. Stun all enemies that have plague and gives 2 experience. The sweet spot for this is probably 3 or 4 targets. Otherwise, this is not great for a loss, although it does net you 2 experience, so it's fine in the final room of a snare to level up a bit. But a bottom loss that can stun 2 to 3 targets, sometimes even 4, is very powerful, and is a great way to kind of help when this situation is not going as well as you might expect. Maybe you had some bad luck in the last round or two with modifiers or things like that. So overall, Delirium's Dance, you're going to pack this card for this top half very likely anyways, so the bottom is mostly free. It's unfortunate the initiative sucks so much, but that is fairly standard for this class. Next up is Gift of Rot. This is a loot 1, and then you may heal 1 all allies that have poison within range 5 and give them ward. And then this is a bit of text you're going to see quite a bit on the heals for this class. For each target, you may heal that target as if they did not have poison. If you do, their poison is not removed. So this is a pretty value-packed loot action, especially when top loots are much easier to use than bottom loots. This is ideal after a couple rounds of having an ally poisoned, as you can get rid of their poison and give them ward on top of it to keep them alive. But it's also flexible enough with its warding, where you can give them the heal 1 and ward without removing the poison, in case your next couple rounds have actions that perhaps need poisoned allies or things like that. Initiative at 47 here is our worst yet, and it's pretty emblematic of this class's inability to go super slow or fast. They have a few cards early on that go fast, but some of them are of a lower quality comparatively because they go so fast, and your initiative problems actually get worse at higher levels, especially in the mid levels, where your cards get closer and closer toward the middle of the spectrum, and you lose more and more access to these fast cards. So you may be looking at this going, well, Megadis, there's a bunch of cards in the 10 to like 18 range right now, but you may not be running them in the future, and you may not be running all of them ever, just depending on what you need. So as you do have a couple cards that are fast, but it's not enough compared to how many slow cards you were then given and offered in the mid levels for this class. Hence what the initiative control issues that I've mentioned. But overall, 47 is really unfortunate, but it is kind of par for the course. Bottom here is a move 2. You may give one ally within range 3 poison to gain advantage in all of your attacks this round. This is usually just a small move that gives you the ability to give an ally poison mostly for free. Advantage in all of your attacks is fine, but not super exciting. You're not a heavy hitting class when it comes to attacks, and your attacks start so small that giving them like a +1 instead of a 0 really isn't super exciting. This does get better at higher levels with a better perk deck, but your perk deck is of a fairly average quality and nothing significantly crazy compared to some other classes. So overall, this ability is just a fine way to give an ally poison, but overall isn't a super powerful way to enable that or give you a reward for doing so. Overall, actions like Delirium's Dance adding stun for a poison are much more powerful. So really, Gift of Rot has a reasonable top half, a bad initiative, and a pretty mediocre bottom half. So this is a very, very normal for an X card, not something you're always going to want to play. But if you are more into the poison build, then this is something you're probably going to run for at least a couple levels. And finally, our last level 1 X card is Spread the Plague. Top controls one enemy that has Plague to make an attack for Plague in melee that gives 1 experience. This is numerically the strongest attack you have, although it is fairly conditional. You need a plagued monster that is adjacent to another monster, and this does use the monster deck. for attacking. So if you're in a party that is more curse focused, this loses some of its luster, as the monster may pull the curse that you've put in there yourself, which is definitely a feel bad. Otherwise, this is a very solid action and a nice payoff for plagues, and it continues to spread it, and is one of the best ways for the class to continue to chugging along. And of course, this being an attack 4 is very notable for this class, who simply just can't do that amount of damage at this level otherwise. Initiative at 35 here is a bit better than Gift of Rot's 47, but still far from ideal. So we had the kind of glut of fast cards in the middle of the level 1 cards, and then the rest have all been quite far in the spectrum. Bottom here is a poison plague, targets one enemy that is adjacent to one of your allies that has poison. Then you remove the poison from that ally. So this is basically poison plague a target and you heal one a poisoned ally in the right situation, which is solid value for a bottom action, but is also quite finicky and easy to have be completely blank. I like this mostly as a free roll, as the top is easier to achieve and both are potent in the right situation. Although it did come up once or twice that both halves were blank, which definitely isn't ideal. Our party can kill things pretty quickly, which means their Plague Herald was often searching for a plague target adjacent to another monster, and sometimes we had to end up killing one of the two, unfortunately, because we just only had so many targets. So overall, I think this is probably worth bringing for most Plague Heralds at level 1, simply for the top action. The bottom half will happen every now and then, but is pretty hard to actually have occur, which is why when I was talking earlier about the inability to plague as a bottom action, I didn't even mention this card because it is so specific. It is, in theory, a way to do so as a non-loss, but it's just so hard to put together most of the time when the top half is just such a simple, easy way to attack and spread the plague. So that's part of it as well. For a level 1 card choice, as mentioned before, you do not have enough cards to focus on only Plague or Poison at level 1, so there will be some mix and matching regardless, at least early on. I would recommend start by playing at least 6 Plague cards and a handful of Poison cards, ideally 3 or 4, as some will fit in both categories between their top and bottom actions. I'll recommend a few cards that are worth a look at cutting depending. Early levels are a good way to figure out which build you want to focus on in the future. To start, Accelerated End is a reasonable cut. The top half only helps adding to a target that is already plagued and doesn't actually spread it, whereas the bottom is a clunky way to poison enemies and allies alike. Its initiative is fine, but is replaceable as well. Blistering Buboes, despite the great name, is a pretty good cut. Neither half helps spread the plague or poison as a non-loss. The best part about this card is its initiative, so do keep in mind you will need at least a few fast ones. I just generally prefer some of the other faster initiatives over this card. Um, Gift of Rot is another reasonable cut here. Two medium halves. It's a loot that does need poisoned allies, and the move action to give an ally poison doesn't have a ton of upside, but only giving you advantage on your likely 1 or 2 attacks in the round. It also has your worst initiative. So if you are really concerned about initiative control, it is a pretty easy cut that way. Spread the Plague. It has 2 powerful halves that are conditional. I like the card, and it was quite good for us, but there's a chance the card is blank some portion of the time, which is definitely a cost and something you may not be really into. Another potential cut is Wretched Yield. It is the weaker of the 2 move 4s, the pretty mediocre top action. However, it is also your slowest initiative. I think it's perfectly fine to just run both move 4s at level 1. However, if you do have the flying perk and are running most, if not all, of your move 3s, you may not need this. And then Contagious Corpse is a potential cut. It has, again, 2 medium halves, the attack through range 3, potential curse, and then move 3 that gives a poison ally some shields. But it does have a good fast initiative and a pretty reasonable floor compared to some of the other cards that may be blank at times. So overall, I do lean towards running Contagious Corpse, but it is kind of on that chopping block. Finally, Virulent Strain could be a pretty reasonable cut. This one here. On the next 3 attacks performed by one of your allies, it has poison, add +1 to the attack and plague. If you're struggling to have allies that are poisoned, The bottom half is reasonable but replaceable as well. Again, the initiative isn't anything critical here. I do think this is one of your better poison payoffs, but you can kind of customize your deck based on what you find is best. Maybe you don't need this action. So those are some of the cards I'd recommend at cutting. The rest I think are pretty core for a level 1 build. In particular, Biting Gnats is a standout. Festering Sores, Vile Pestilence, and Delirium's Dance for me are probably the top 4. You could also potentially look at cutting something like Cormorbid's Sting, but I do like that both halves contribute to your game plan here. The top half being Poison and Plague, whereas the bottom half gives an ally poison to also get a free bottom attack. So, as far as starting item choices go, this is another class where a lot of the starting items are pretty medium with no real standouts. Thankfully, you're also likely Prosperity 2, or at least close to unlocking it at this point. So you should have some more options between that and snares that you may have completed. So I'll go through some reasonable non-spoiler items just in case. First off, Stamina Potion is always a really solid one, especially for classes that need to sequence properly for good effect. And sometimes one half of the sequencing doesn't line up and you need a do-over. This is often used to pick up the attack 2 all plague targets or the attack 1 target 2 plague action, Biting Gnats. Weathered Shoes are pretty reasonable to make your basic move actions move 3s or up your move 3 to move 4s. With the flying perk, they are better than a move 3 jump, which is nice. Simple Bow is fine but unexciting, giving you advantage on range attacks when you make multiple in a round, which is pretty common. Note this does not work with a few of your cards, namely those that grant the monster's attack actions and things like that. As always, Leather Armor is a good pickup on low health characters to avoid getting one shot by an errant hit. In general, you won't get hit all that much on this class as you are long ranged, so it makes Leather Armor better because if you get attacked roughly once or twice per cycle, it's kind of the sweet spot for Leather Armor to do its thing. Amulet of Life is nice for the heal oneself. However, it is better on your allies as they may want the ability to easily cleanse poisons that you give to them. As far as a couple items I would not recommend, Wing Shoes is definitely the number one not recommended, as they'll be immediately useless once you get the flying perk. And then the other one is Poison Dagger is incredibly awkward on this class, and not recommended as you essentially have no melee attacks. So despite you wanting poison targets, it is typically your allies that you want poisoned. There's only a couple cards that key off poison monsters, and it's going to be essentially impossible to trigger the fact that it only works on melee attacks, so you'd have to do like a basic melee attack too to use the Poison Dagger. At level 2, our first option is Rot Maggots. Top is an attack 4, range 3 poison, and then each ally adjacent to the target also gains poison. So an attack 4 is definitely above the curve, especially for this class. But range 3 is actually fairly uncommon and a decent bit of a downside, as they very often operate around range 4 or 5, which is a bit of a knock against it. Each ally adjacent to the target gaining poison would normally be a pretty decent downside. Of course, with this class, it does enable the poison build easily, although it doesn't provide any benefit for the poison right away, so you'll need to pair this with other cards that do so pretty quickly afterwards. As this is your largest attack alongside Spread the Plague, the forcing a monster to attack for 4 and plaguing at level 1, that of course was more conditional, but Plagues, which is in a vacuum more valuable than poisoning an ally for this class specifically. Initiative at 69 here is pretty awful for the top, as you both need a monster within range 3 and an ally next to them to get maximum value out of this. This is generally easier to do earlier on in a round, and the poison you afflict the monster with more effective the earlier you do it as well. However, if you're poisoning an ally, you may want to go very slowly with this so they don't get popped for a bunch of damage. So there's a bit of tension there. Bottom is a semi-persistent loss. At the end of this and your next 3 turns, each enemy suffers 1 true damage for each plague that enemy has. This on the surface probably looks pretty powerful. We actually had some trouble keeping monsters with plague alive for more than a round or two, as we're often ripping through monsters to try and stay alive ourselves. So this would often be a pretty low value option, doing something like maybe 5 to 7 damage over the course of the 4 rounds. We get a couple damage for the first couple rounds, and then the monsters are likely dead by the second or third, and the fourth was spent either trying to get to the next door and opening it, or resting up for the next onslaught. As a result, this will likely be best in boss scenarios or in scenarios with few but larger rooms, which isn't ideal for a leveled lost card. Usually like them to be less specific. Other option here is Sickening Strength. Top strengthens 2 allies that have poison within a range 5. Each target may then suffer 2 damage to immediately play 1 card from their hand, performing either the top or bottom action of that card. This was pretty cool. Between the 2 allies, your team essentially gets a full extra player's worth of actions. And of course, this is significantly worse in 2-player and is easier to pull off in something like 3 or ideally 4-player, as you do need to be poisoning 2 allies for maximum effect. We had some pretty crazy situations with this card, giving our Spellweaver and 3 Spears extra actions while strengthened. And the way this is worded, they still keep the strengthened for their actual turn, as this doesn't give the players a turn, they just play a card from their hand. So they're getting strengthened for the action you give them, as well as their actual turn. Initiative at 19 here is really nice, as the top typically wants to go before your allies for best effect, of course, and this is pretty fast for a slow class like Plague Herald. Bottom is another one of these move 4s. This is fantastic when paired with a good initiative and makes the top much easier to swallow, as it is a situational top ability with a universally useful bottom action and a good initiative. Makes this easy to use in all but the most dedicated plague builds who may not be able to use the top very well. So for level 2 card choice, our group's Plague Herald chose Sickening Strength and was generally quite happy with it. She managed to pull off a double strength and play an extra card a decent amount, and also add another fast initiative and move 4 to her arsenal on top of that. Big moves are really nice for this class as they don't often move on a turn, and they move every other turn or even less sometimes, which makes move 4s even more important to keep up with the party. I do really like the top half of Rot Maggots, but it is a more one-dimensional card, as the initiative is quite poor and the loss is powerful but situational. Given that both cards have one staple action and one situational one, I lean towards the one with the better initiative, so in this case, Sickening Strength. 3, we have Cloying Miasma. Top is an attack 1, range 4 disarm plague, which is a really nice way to take a monster out of a round of combat and set up for the following turn via plague. It is awkward that you have a way to add a target to this, which is really, really powerful, but it is your other level 3 card. So you would need to do something like skipping both 4s in order to get both of them realistically. I do appreciate that this is range 4, although the enhancement pip can only take +1 here, unfortunately. Love to add another condition, but of course that might be a little bit too powerful. Regardless, this is a good solid action that advances your game plan for Plague while also being defensive in nature, so it gets good marks from me here. Initiative at 20 here is essentially the same as Sickening Strengths from level 2, which was 19. Fast enough for this class, even if it would not be impressive on many other classes such as Silent Knife or Mind Thief, just not quite fast enough for some turns. Bottom gives you and all allies advantage on all attacks targeting enemies that have Plague this round. This is very powerful in its simplicity and pairs well either after a Biting Gnats a double plague turn or even this turn. You wouldn't get the advantage from it, of course. This is often paired with Vile Pestilence's attack to all plague targets. My biggest complaint with this card is it often wants to go about 5 to 10 initiative for faster so badly, especially for the bottom, as we had a decent few situations where we were going in the 15 to 19 initiative range right before the Plague Herald gave us all advantage. So we started learning around that kind of planning, but the first couple times it was wasted just simply due to other classes going a little bit faster. Other option at level 3 is Nightmarish Affliction. Top is an attack 1, range 4, poison curse. You may give one ally within range 3 of you poison to add +1 target and gain 1 experience. So to start an attack 1 poison curse is reasonable but unexciting for a level 3 card, but being able to add a target by poisoning an ally within a range 3 kills 2 birds with 1 stone. Of course, this is incredible for the poison ally build. Flipping 2 modifiers, poisoning and cursing 2 targets, assuming they don't die to the attack 1, is a lot of value. and it's not difficult to pay allies back for the poison with your other actions. I especially like this followed by Sickening Strength from level 2. The double strength and play a card is a great way to let your allies blow up the targets that you just poisoned. Initiative at 43 here is awkward and definitely not ideal. If you took Rot Maggots at the previous level, not having access to the 19 or 20s offered by the other level 2 and 3 cards may make your initiative control pretty poor. So that's something to keep in mind. Bottom is a semi-persistent loss. It gives you the same ability the top offers, basically giving an ally within range 3 of you poison to add a target to any of your next 6 ranged attacks, which is very, very powerful. This does work with ones that are already multi-target as well. So this works with action, but this works particularly well with actions that don't by default, such as the disarm from the other level 3. The multi-target and multiple poison from Biting Gnats is great. Poison Plague, Morbid Sting from level 1. It also works very well with Rot Maggots, the other level 2, the attack 4. So if you can deal with the poor initiative control, 2 attack 4 poisons is a lot of damage for this class. This loss is very flexible, and it contributes to your poison and ally sub-theme. Despite it not numerically being the strongest loss, it has a lot of cool moving parts, and you have some very powerful attacks that you'd love to kind of twin. So overall, Nightmare's Affliction has 2 very strong halves, kind of held back by a poor initiative. So for level 3 card choice, obviously, as I've said, both these cards are quite excellent. Cloying Miasma is my default pick. The Disarm Plague and giving all of your allies advantage in key rounds as a bottom action. I would definitely look ahead at your level 4s, as if you aren't overly enthused about either of them. I think picking up Nightmarish Affliction to pair with the Disarm from Cloying Miasma for that extra target is such a nice combo. And the top half being a double curse, double poison that also poisons an ally is really nice as well. This card is just really, really efficient and contributes to the game plan of poisoning an ally, which may become very relevant at higher levels here. If you took Rot Maggots at level 2, this is a very strong choice in Nightmare's Affliction. Your biggest weakness will definitely be initiative control, and that really won't get better until quite high levels. So do keep that in mind, but that may be a price some are willing to pay because these cards do pair so well together. At level 4, our first option is Rabid Bite. You start by strengthening a normal or elite enemy that has Plague. You then control the target of the strengthened ability to perform a move 1. This movement must move towards a monster that does not have Plague, and then you perform an attack 5 Plague and gain 1 experience with the monster. This attack will have advantage, of course, because you strengthen them, which might be important if you're playing any of the cards or perks that curse the monsters. This is generally an upgrade to spread the Plague from level 1 as an attack 4 from a plagued monster, but they also play well on successive turns. Typically, Rabid Bite is better done first, as otherwise the move ability will likely need to be skipped, because otherwise it'll go to waste. Initiative at 70 here is fine, but unexciting, as the top needs monsters near one another and one of them to be plagued. So it is a little finicky and would actually prefer to go fast. The bottom is fine, going slow at least. So this will be fine some portion of the time. The bottom is another big move. It's your first to move 5. If you didn't take the move 4 on Sickening Strength at level 2, this is probably a pretty big deal. Otherwise, you will have 3 move 4s available to you, so this is a good stable action, but not as necessary to take. I always like situational halves paired with stable halves, and this card did play pretty well in our group. Move 5s with flying can cover a ton of distance, and at times this is actually better than a move 7 for a non-flying player. Other option here at level 4 is Unwilling Sacrifice. Top says 1 enemy suffers 2 damage for each plague it has. You may remove any number of plagues from that enemy, even if this ability kills it. To have that number of different enemies adjacent to it suffer 1 damage and gain plague, and then you gain 1 experience. This really wants a monster with 2 plague tokens on it at minimum. Once you do, it becomes 4 true damage that can jump to another target or 2, deal an extra point of damage, and most notably, reapplying the plague. It is one of the few good payoffs we've seen so far for going tall on one target for plagues. although it is at odds with your average plague payoff that wants multiple plague targets, sometimes as many as possible. So overall, I view this to be a slight upgrade to Path of the Pox, the card that makes them always take 3 and adjacent monsters suffer 1, regardless of how many Plague tokens are on them. The biggest difference being that adjacent monsters for this one gain Plague as well, which is very important. Initiative at 29 here is similar to Rabid Bite 70, but on the other end of the spectrum. A mediocre but passable number, but nothing exciting. Bottom here is a poison targeting 3 things within range 4. I actually kind of wish this was worded differently so you could poison allies as well, as I think this card would be quite nice if you could poison 1 or 2 allies plus 1 or 2 monsters, instead of needing 3 monsters nearby and not furthering your poison ally build. Overall, this is a fine action, but because it doesn't help either major build, it is kind of a pain, with the top being fairly finicky. So for level 4 card choice, I think I like Rabid Bite over Unwilling Sacrifice here, but I also acknowledge that both level 3s are, in my opinion, of a higher quality overall, mostly due to their synergy with each other and other cards available to at this point, in particular the level 2s. I think Unwilling Sacrifice does have its place, but both halves are a little finicky and vary in their potency quite a bit, which is worrisome from a class that already suffers from having swingy or sometimes ineffective turns. So I think there's a lot of reasonable options here, and I do think going back for both 3s does look nice. So you're really going to have to kind of look at what you want to do. I will say Rabid Bite did play very well for us, so no real complaints there. All right, we're halfway there. At level 5, our first option is Compounding Infection. Top is a Curse Plague at range 4, which of course is below rate. However, this waits in your active zone for the next time an enemy draws a curse during its attack. You may then discard this card to have that enemy gain Curse, Curse, Plague, Plague. So this, if it's your only curse card slash ability, I would leave it at home. But if you're running the Curse perk plus ideally Nightmarish Affliction from level 3 to double Curse, and potentially Contagious Corpse from level 1 to kill, to curse a target that kills with the attack, it's a good start to having this be a self-fulfilling loop of value, as getting 3 curses and 3 plagues per rest cycle is pretty bananas on a single card, and pairs so well with allies that can also curse. The cherry on top is any and all muddles you can throw at the monsters gain so much value in this kind of build. So things like Biting Gnats muddle all plague targets. It becomes very potent with this as well. Overall, I like this action. It's build situational, but is also evocative of old Plague Herald, who very often easily maxed out the monster curses while also still playing into their new plague mechanics. So it's kind of a cool intersection there. And it creates a bit of a sub build, which we often see in level 5 cards in second edition as well, which I always appreciate. Initiative at 62 here follows a pretty big trend of powerful cards with bad initiatives for this class. I actually think this class rivals Craighheart for the worst initiative control of the 9 cards I have looked at thus far in second edition. And our Plague Herald definitely noticed this and tried to remedy it through good communication and items in her time playing this class. The bottom is a persistent loss. Your character allies that have poison add +1 to all their attacks. Of course, this doesn't work with summons because they're not characters. While this is undeniably powerful, from our experience, we're usually keeping the poison on us for only a couple key turns and then typically cleansing it off to not die to the monsters that we're fighting. So this may end up being pretty finicky unless you're playing a lot of the poison ally cards, and your allies are okay staying poisoned for most of the scenario, which can be a really big problem. So overall, I really like Compounding Infections top. The initiative and the bottom for me are of a lower quality, but the bottom definitely has a lot of power behind it, especially if you're paired with allies who make many attacks, such as Spellweaver or potentially a Bruiser. Other option at level 5 here is Wilt and Wither. Top is an attack 1, target 2, range 5 that plagues, and then each enemy suffers 1 true damage for each plague that enemy has. So the top reminds me a lot of Biting Gnats from level 1. Instead of muddling plague targets, it makes them take true damage, so this is definitely better on average. And it also scales based on how many plagues they have, so this can deal 2 or 3 damage to some monsters as well. Plague and true damage to the targets sets it up so nicely for your other actions that want to plague as well and asks nearly nothing from you, as range 5 is absolutely massive. So this was the level where Plague Herald finally felt it was easy to chain Plague creation into Plague payoff turns, as a critical mass of these kind of cards made sequencing so much easier for her. This class's large amount of true damage is very important for us against monster types such as Flame Demons that were miserable for a lot of classes to deal with otherwise. Initiative at 91 here is your slowest yet and isn't beaten until level 7. So it's definitely a big selling point for the card, even if it doesn't necessarily work all that well with the top. The bottom wants to go faster exactly once per scenario, so it's not a deal breaker per se, although definitely a little awkward at times. This will likely be one paired with a bottom action that wants to go slow a decent amount of the time. So the bottom here is a semi-persistent loss. During this and your next turn, double all damage that enemies that have plague would suffer. So of course this doesn't double all damage dealt from your allies unless they deal damage during your turn. So this followed by Sickening Strength to give allies strength and then play one card from their hands for free is very powerful, or something like your attack 2 against all plague targets is essentially necessary to make this feel powerful and worthy of a level 5 loss. It was good for us, although it was only played twice. It was very powerful in both situations, as of course our playground weighted. One was a boss scenario, and one was where there was many monsters that were plagued. So it's definitely situational overall, and typically reserved best for those kind of situations, and not something you just run out in every scenario, especially with how powerful and useful the top action is here. So for level 5 card choice, I think both cards are very good, but also very different. And I think the bulk of the power contained is in both top actions either way, with both bottom actions being more situational and finicky here. If you have allies that curse or other abilities and perks that allow you to curse, then Compounding Infection is a great way to enable sort of a third build that combines curses and plagues together. If that looks like it's not going to be a reality for you, I highly recommend Wilton Wither. It's fantastic at both spreading the plague and being a self-contained payoff for the plague that you pay very little for, as the top and initiative are both great, so you really don't pay much for the bottom. And it was very good the couple times we used the bottom. In fact, we actually used it to retire our Plague Herald in her final retirement scenario. It was a very hard boss encounter, and she dealt a ton of damage to the boss in one turn with a double damage. So uh, Overall, I think these are both fantastic cards. It's really hard to go wrong unless you have no curses and take Compounding Infection for some reason, and can't utilize the bottom either. At level 6, our first option is Crippling Malady. Top is an attack 2 targeting 2 enemies at any range that have Plague. On each target, add +1 to the attack for each Plague that target has and gives 1 experience. These are really attack 3s at minimum, the way this is worded, because you can only target plague targets. So this will scale between an attack 3 and an attack 5 on each target. This is really quite reasonable and scales well with monsters that have multiple stacks of plague. This is a pretty simple action to get value out of at this point in your career. It's also not limited by range at all, so you can safely hit 2 targets provided they're within line of sight and have plague. This combos really nicely from a previous turn's Wilton Wither or Biting Gnats from level 1, which both, of course, plague 2 targets, again at long range. Initiative at 26 here is nice, but again, nothing too exciting. Plague Herald can pretty easily go in the 20 to 30 range, as many of their faster cards that are offered end up in that range, especially at higher levels. Bottom is Immobilize all enemies that have Plague. This is a very nice bottom action, as Mobilize will definitely lock down melee monsters from hitting you or advancing closer due to your long range. As always with Immobilize, this will vary in its effectiveness based on monster ability cards and whether or not they tend to be melee or ranged. But this is nice opposite such a bread and butter top action. I like having this at the ready for situations when it's good, as you'll primarily prepare this card for the top half, and when the bottom works out, you just get to use it and feel good about it. Other option here at level 6 is Succumb to the Gift. Top is an attack 5, targeting one enemy at any range that has Plague with advantage. If the attack ability killed an enemy, gain 1 experience and create 1/3 true damage, poison trap, and the featureless hex they occupied. This is a very wordy way to say that you get to attack 5 at advantage a target that has plague, which is the bulk of the text here. While the poison damage trap is very flavorful, it is fairly hard for you to utilize on your own, as you really only have one way to make monsters move. You don't have any push or pull, so it's going to be Rabid's Bite move 1 from level 4 if you took that card. It's also restrictive in the fact that it must move towards an unplagued monster. So this is definitely going to be hard to engineer by yourself. So I would more so look for allies such as Mind Thief or Tinkerer who have more access to either mind control abilities or push and pull to really value the trap here. On its surface, this is an attack 5 advantage against a plague target, which is solid value, but similar to Crippling Maladies, top nothing outstanding either way, and very similar in terms of how they work as well. Initiative 81 here I like better than Maladies 26. So access to going quite slow has been fairly limited, especially in the mid levels, so this definitely has more relevance. Bottom is a move 4. You then bless all allies that have poison within range 5 of you. If this blesses a single ally, you're pretty happy with it. As tied to a move 4, this is a sweet little value action, and our first big move offered since Rabid Bite at level 4, which you may not have taken. If you aren't playing any of the cards that poison allies, then this is definitely below par as just a move 4, but I do think this is worth it a reasonable amount of the time, and it also has a good initiative and a good top half here, so there really isn't much to complain about. So for level 6 card choice, I actually think both options are pretty good here. In a vacuum, most Plague Heralds will be able to use Crippling Maladies top half, as it simply needs monsters that are plagued, as well as the bottom. However, if you're running multiple attack abilities that poison allies, I do think Succumb to the Gift here gets it by a slight edge, as I like the attack 5 advantage giving us access to a beefy attack, which isn't something we've really had outside of monster commands, as well as a sweet move forward that has a bless or two with a better initiative. But really, I think both cards are very solid here. And I do like the Crippling Malady can be like an attack 3 or attack 4 against 2 targets a reasonable amount of the time. First up, we have Mass Extinction. Top is a loss, an attack 4 targeting one enemy at any range that has Plague. Whenever this ability kills an enemy, gain 1 experience, add +2 to the attack, and +1 target. This is an incredible ability, but does require some setup. Of course, you're going to need as many plague targets as possible, and the key is starting with a low health target. So this may require some coordination between you and your allies as well. But an attack 4, followed by an attack 6, 8, 10, 12, etc., truly clears the room pretty easily until you miss something, which is likely when you pull your null. So of course, sources of advantage are strengthened. Basically, this is very likely with good setup to clear an entire room of plague targets, which could be most of, or maybe just over half the room, depending. So very, very powerful for a level 7 loss. I love this kind of ability, and this does lead me to believe, alongside the attack to all plague targets from level 1 that we've had access to, that going wide with this class on plague is often going to be better than going tall, as there's really, really good payoffs for going wide with the class, whereas going tall, you have a couple abilities that stand out, but mostly it's like +1 damage and things like that. So this is definitely the kind of ability where you're going to want to look at the initiative in the bottom half, as you're going to be using those for the bulk of the scenario. And then when the timing is right, you pull the trigger on the top and just blow up a room. Get a bunch of experience, fun, splashy loss. Definitely a powerful card. Initiative at 94 here is a sterling slow initiative, and actually I do argue works pretty well for the top, as I think you're best served going late in a round and waiting for there to be monsters that are low health, coordinate with your allies, have them leave something alive, and wait for the things to be as plagued as possible, and then kind of unload with the top action here. So I think 94 not only works well for this ability, but also works well for the class in general, as we really haven't been offered many late ones. They have late's actually gotten a little bit better in the last couple levels than early initiatives, but early on you really did struggle for late initiatives, so this is still welcome here. Bottom is one of the cleanest lines of text I've ever seen on a card, especially a high level card, being a simple plague within range 5. Of course, on the surface, this probably looks extremely underwhelming, But as mentioned before, we've had a single non-loss way to apply Plague on the bottom of a card before this, and it was extremely finicky. So this, while not being impressive, is going to be very important and is one of the few ways to consistently apply 3 plagues per turn, combined with Biting Gnats and Wilt and Weather from level 1 and 5 respectively. Also at the same range, which is really nice. So while this may not be exciting, this is a very good ability for any Plague Herald who is going down the Plague path. And something that I do love alongside the splashy top loss, as the bottom is going to be something you want to use in most rest cycles anyways. Other level 7 here is Tainted Offering. Top is an attack 3 range 4 poison. You may give one ally within range 3 of you poison to gain 1 experience and perform an attack 2 range 3 poison. You perform the attack as if you're occupying the hex of the ally you poisoned. So this is a really good ability for the poison build. You get 2 attacks, both of them poison. They can also target different targets or the same, of course, because they're separate lines of text. This has a lot going on. You can unload on one thing, the first poison making the second attack stronger for your cumulative 6 effort, or you can spread it out and deal damage and help your allies kill targets. All it asks of you is having an ally within range 3, which is not difficult for the top half of a card. And this actually combines really well with Nightmare's Afflictions, add a target, bottom loss, because both of these can add a target in theory with enough allies nearby you. So you can do something in theory, something like 3 or 4 attacks with this card, all of which would poison, which can really do a ton of damage. So overall, I think this is a fantastic way to really support the poison build while still dealing damage. It enables the poison build while still outputting a lot of effort for your party. Initiative at 33 here is incredibly average and poor overall for this class. I'm not surprised at this point to see this number here. This class has pretty much exclusively gone in the 20 to 75 range for initiative. It's gotten a little better in the late side, like mentioned with Mass Extinction going late, but it really does struggle to go early. So it's nothing too surprising at this point to see a 33 here. At least it's not a 50. Bottom is a heal 2 all allies that have poison within range 5 and strengthens them. Each target may recover 1 level 1 card from the discard pile. For each target, you may heal that target as if they did not have poison. If you do, their poison is not removed. This has a lot going on and definitely wants probably 2 targets that are poisoned, as a lot of your poison cards do. But heal 2, strengthen, and a stamina potion is bananas for a bottom action if you can hit anything more than 1 target. Even with 1 target, I'm reasonably happy with this. So this is fantastic. Both halves play well together for the same build. Very cohesive that way. This is a very strong card for the poison build, and it's nice to see a really good cohesive payoff. So for the level 7 card choice, this is by far the most binary and basic of them. Tainted Offering is fantastic for poison builds. Mass Extinction is fantastic for plague builds. There really isn't too much more to say here. I think at this point you're going to know which one you want. So at level 8, we have Convert the Flock. Top is a loss. Convert all normal and elite enemies that have plague to perform a move 2 attack 5 poison plague. Gives you 2 experience. This is very odd to me as it has very similar text and purpose to Mass Extinction from the previous level and also for the same build. This is safer as you'll get multiple kills pretty much guaranteed and doesn't stop if one of them misses. But essentially cannot clear a room like Mass Extinction either because the monsters killing each other limits how many control actions you get and you control all of them simultaneously. So the new ones don't get to be plagued if they weren't plagued at the start of the action either. The other thing is I don't know who wants 2 copies of this card because it and Mass Extinction are so similar and fulfill the same role. And anyone who would have taken a plague card would have taken Mass Extinction at the previous level. So it's not like there was like, oh, maybe they didn't take Mass Extinction, but were plague, because that seems very unlikely. The other card was so poison focused. So some awkwardness here. The initiative at 57 definitely doesn't do it any favors either. Ideally, you want to go quickly while the monsters are still nearby one another and haven't died to your allies, or potentially slow to try and wait the monsters to group up. So either way, 57 doesn't help, as you have very little control over when you actually go on around. The bottom says one enemy that has poison or plague gains plague and suffers 3 true damage. If that enemy dies, gain 1 experience, and you may teleport to the hex it occupied. This is a good action. I do really like the flexibility of this working with a poisoned or plagued monster. So cards such as Tainted Offering at the previous level mean that even a poisoned ally build could make this work. If you can kill the target, the teleport is incredible here. So often read, deal 3 true damage and move 3 or 4 hexes, which is a very good bottom action. If it doesn't kill the target, it's not ideal, but you know based on the fact that it's true damage whether or not it will, so you're really just going to save this for killing targets to get that teleport a lot of the time. Other option here at level 8 is Creeping Lethargy. Top is a heal 1 for all in this case meaning all allies and yourself, not monsters. And then each enemy adds -2 to all of their attacks this round for each plague that enemy has. This is again very strange, as the heal does potentially cleanse the poison off your allies and doesn't have the usual line of text where you can heal them as if they're not poisoned to get around that. The -2 to monster attacks per plague is great and would be amazing as a bottom action, but as a top it means you're probably not assisting with killing monsters this round, which leaves your allies needing to be able to output damage, because otherwise you're just treading water by making them skip their attacks, and only if they are plagued. So there's some finicky units there. Initiative at 13 here is necessary for both halves, as they're both proactive but also defensive. It's also a welcome number, as your ability to go faster than 15 has essentially been non-existent thus far past level 1. This is a big selling point to the card, as I do find both halves to be pretty underwhelming otherwise. Bottom is a move 4. You may then negate the next source of damage. One adjacent ally that has poison would suffer this round. This is very finicky, as you need to be adjacent to an ally after the move. That ally has to be poisoned, and they need to suffer damage, likely from a hit, that wouldn't hit you instead, as you are also nearby and at a very fast initiative of 13. It's not like the ally can even move away after the ability either, because they need to stay next to you for the ability to trigger. So this is a glorified move 4 that won't have a lot of other text. It'll occasionally block something like an attack 1 or attack 2 early on in a round, a reasonable amount of the time, because typically faster monster actions have lower attack values. So a lot of moving parts here. It's essentially a move 4 with initiative 13 with some other text that comes up occasionally, and the top is very odd and defensive in nature here. So for the level 8 card choice, after the crazy strong level 7s, these are a bit of a letdown for me, as I find neither is necessary for either of the major builds of this class. Convert the Flock's top is altogether too similar to Mass Extinction for my tastes, and it doesn't really have a home due to that, as I don't think many people are going to want two of the exact same style of effect with this massive room clearing effect or close to room clearing effect that only works on plague targets. Um, of the 4 actions, I find the bottom action of Convert the Flock to definitely be the strongest, but it also is tied to a much worse initiative. So if you think you can utilize Creeping Lethargy for really any of its parts, the initiative 13 here is a really big selling point. If you are just kind of locked into not worrying about initiative control at this point because you've already made a bunch of other card decisions that way, and if 113 isn't necessarily going to save you, then I do think Convert the Flock's bottom action here is the pick. Because there will be some situations where the top half is more useful than Mass Extinction for plague builds. Of course, neither of these are super honed in on the poison sub build. The bottom half of Creeping Lethargy does some of that, but again, it's so finicky with moving parts that I don't even know if I'd consider it to be consistent even in the poison build. At level 9, our first option is Disease Vector. Top is an attack 1, target 3, range 5 plague. You then poison all enemies that have plague. This is so nice, just kind of seeing the progression for these styled abilities. Biting Gnats from level 1, then Wilt and Wither from level 5, and finally Disease Vector here at 9, being these multi-target attacks that apply Plague and then punish all monsters that have Plague. Of course, this one having a third target is definitely the best of the bunch and very comfortably replaces Biting Gnats from level 1 here, which at this point has probably outlived its usefulness. Poisoning all 3 of the targets and plaguing them is very powerful, and you may even poison other targets, of course, that you've plagued previously. So this is a great capstone ability for the plague build, nice and simple to use, gets the point across, allows you to plague 3 targets very easily, as range 5 is longer than most rooms in Gloomhaven. Initiative at 64 here is bad, but it's better than your other level 9 choice, which is a 46. They really do hammer home the initiative problems this class has at level 9, huh? Bottom is a clean. Each enemy suffers 2 damage for each plague that enemy has. This is definitely the best payoff thus far for going tall with plague, but at the same time is also good for going wide with it. So this is a fantastic ability that will do 2 to 6 damage to most monsters in the room, which is insane when it's a bottom action, non-loss, and is true damage, so it's very consistent as well. Other option at level 9 here is Zorn's Embrace. Grant all allies that have poison and attack 3 range 3, and then they heal X self or X the amount of damage dealt with the granted attack ability. This heal ignores poison and does not remove it. Wow, what a capstone for the poison build. This is often going to be like a heal 4 or 5 self after modifiers, unless you're against heavily shielded targets. So giving even 2 allies an attack 3 range 3 heal 4 self is incredible. It's something you can do every single uh, rest cycle. This is very, very nice. And it does work with all allies, not just your character allies. This works with NPC allies and even summons as well, which is very notable for the poison build because many of your abilities haven't worked with those types yet. So this is even better than it looks, and getting 3 or 4 targets in like a summon-based party may actually be pretty achievable. Initiative at 46 here, as referenced in Disease Vector section, is awful, and at this point is kind of par for the course for a poor pile of bugs, pardon me. That's a lot of P's in a row. But regardless, you have other cards to pair with. I wouldn't play a 46 as your leading card often, especially with the kind of ability like the top is, where you want to make a bunch of attacks and blow up the room. Bottom is a persistent loss. At the end of each of your turns, one enemy that has both poison and plague suffers 3 true damage. This is an interesting persistent loss, as they need to be both poisoned and plagued, and your ability to poison targets may not be as easy as you might think for the build that can also apply plague easily. The poison sub build for allies also poisons easier than the plague build. So this may be awkward to use unless you've somehow really committed to both. Of course, the payoff is great, but really the top half is so powerful, I'm not really too concerned about it. It's a free roll. If things line up and you can do it well, great. If not, you have a fantastic top half to use anyways. For the level 9 card choices, I do think Disease Vector is the more cohesive card, as both have specifically key into the Plague build and work well together. However, Zorn's Embrace top half is very powerful, even if the bottom half is technically for a different build that also needs poison thrown in on enemies. Like I always say, pick the 9 you like the look of, and for me, when I do plan on playing this class, I'm going to try and make the poison ally thing work. So for me, that'll be a Zorn's Embrace, but I do think Disease Vector has a higher ceiling on power overall. For perks and masteries, as mentioned at the start of this video, I believe essentially all Plague Herald should rush the permanent flying single perk mark here near the bottom. As a single perk, this was powerful and a game-changing loss in first edition, and is very much baked into the power of this class, and part of why they lost one of their cards, going from an 11 to a 10 card hand size. I would highly recommend simply starting with this perk, as you'll have at least one by virtue of retiring at least one class before this in order to get here, and no other perk is as transformative as this, particularly for a single perk mark. I think it's comparable to some doubles and triples, particularly triples on other classes. The next up, we'll just go top to bottom here. Replacing a -1 with a +1. These are very good, simple, effective perks, even if they aren't exciting. As you do a lot of attack 1s and attack 2s, these are very, very good. And if you aren't sure what to do, these are a really good place to start, just amplifying your damage. As with shields on monsters, you often won't deal a ton of damage with your actual attacks otherwise. Next up is replacing a -1 with a 0 that gives the target or one enemy within range 2 of the target plague. These are for the plague build better than the +1s because it's more important to spread the plague as much as possible than replacing a 0 with a 1, as you are replacing the -1 either way. Obviously, for the poison build, less relevant. I'd probably take the +1s over these. But for the plague build, I think these are probably the first pickups after the you have flying perk. Next up, we have replace 1/0 with 1/1 curse cards. These are great, especially if you're going to lean towards the Nightmarish Affliction and level 5 card that get double curse, double plagues in the mid game, as adding ways to the curse to curse the monsters is fairly minimal at early levels for this class. But if you're interested, these are very solid. They're replacing zeros with +1s with curse on them. Next up is replacing 1/0 with 1/1 immobilize. These are more middle of the road for me unless you have a party of almost exclusively ranged attackers, as immobilizes when they are inconsistent and randomist when you draw them means it's hard to plan around them. But if, of course, if you're primarily ranged party, these will often have text when you do pull them. So they do vary quite a bit. Overall, I would say a mid pick for me. Next up is replace 2/1s with 2/2s. This is great mid to late game once you've improved the rest of your attack modifiers, as turning a base attack 1 into 3 from a +2 is very powerful. Although you are replacing 2 of your 1s in the deck with it. So these are just fine and good once you've really started doing multi-target attacks, which is going to start happening around level 3 or 5, depending on your build. Next up, we have two ways to add +1 stun. These are really nice once you're happy with your perk deck, as stuns are so powerful, and it's a +1 on top of that. This class has very little access to rolling, so that does make these a little bit harder to hit. So these are better if with access to things like strengthen or advantage. Next up, we have add 3. Give the target or one enemy within range 2 of the target poison rolling cards. You get all 3 of these for 1 perk mark. This is really, really powerful for the poison build because you can poison your allies, but you can also poison the enemies here as well. So this is a really good flexible perk. It is one of your only 2 rolling options, and you get 3 for the price of 1 perk mark. Poison not only amplifies the damage you deal to the monsters, but also enables your poison cards for allies. So this is a really good perk, and for me, a pretty early one. Next up, we have add 2 heal 1 ally rolling cards. Again, this adds 2 for 1 perk mark, and they're your other rolling cards. That's it, just these 5. And these are really, really important for the poison build, again, as ways to cleanse the poison off your allies once you're done using your cards that key off the poison, and just top up allies that have been wounded and things like that. Again, an early pick for the poison build, not so much for the plague build. Next up, we have ignore negative snare effects and add +1 card. I will say negative snare effects have been pretty brutal in second edition, so this is a solid one. Adding a +1 is pretty medium here. It's good early on and actually gets weaker as you improve the quality of the perks in your deck. But overall, this is a fine early to mid option if you don't like dealing with the negative snare effects, which is totally fair. Finally, for the last 2 non-attack modifier perks we haven't talked about yet, whenever you heal from a long rest, you may remove poison from an ally to add +1 to the heal. Turns your long rest heal to a heal 3 from a heal 2, and you remove poison from an ally. Our Plague Herald almost never long rested, so for her this was just simply not a good option. If you are long resting and the poison build, then this is pretty decent. Otherwise, I don't think this is a priority at all. Finally, we have our double perk mark. Once per scenario, when an enemy that has plague would die, first control that enemy and have it perform the abilities on its ability card, adding poison to all attacks, then it dies. This was incredible for us in numerous situations. Our Plague Hero took this fairly early on, and essentially was looking for opportunities to really leverage this, looking out for monsters with plague that would die that have multi-target attacks, things like that, and really not only spread the plague but deal a ton of damage for 2 perk marks. This is really, really good. It does vary in its potency, so if you're wanting more consistency, you can always go for the attack modifier perks, but this one is both fun and powerful for us, so it is worthy of that double perk mark, which is notable. And then finally, to round out this video, we have the two masteries. In my opinion, these are both quite hard and need specific setups. So for the first one, in a single turn, kill 3 or more enemies without drawing an attack modifier card. This needs a lot of planning. It requires one of your losses early on, or potentially a non-loss at higher levels, likely in the Plague build, as that's usually the ways to kill monsters without attacking. This can be true damage abilities or the control monster abilities, as you don't draw an attack modifier from your deck. Um, but really, it's going to be the easy way is going to be the true damage abilities. Just kind of when it lines up, you do it. Otherwise, it's going to be pretty difficult to pull off. For the second mastery, in a single scenario, either apply or remove poison from an ally or enemy each round. This requires a ton of sequencing and to be the poison ally build pretty much specifically. Our play code actually got close to doing this a couple of times, but every single round is really difficult as you often have off turns on this class, which means the mastery fails if that happens even once. It's probably easiest in a shorter scenario. All right, well that is going to about do it for Plague Herald here. As always, if you've stuck through the whole video, thank you so much. As our group just started with a new group of characters alongside our music note, as we've all retired recently, I'll be doing one of 3 different characters next that all started roughly at the same time. It'll be circles, triangles, sometimes known as Triforce, or Sun. But until next time, we'll see ya and have a good day.